The air in the Century Park Hotel, Chicago, was thick, heavy with the scent of aged wood and the hushed tension of a high-stakes chess tournament. Ricardo, a renowned strategist in his mid-40s, with shrewd eyes and a barely perceptible scar on his right temple, was about to make his final move. Suddenly, a tremor. Not on the board, but in the very structure of the world. The crystal chandelier above him swayed, accompanied by a cracking sound, like bones breaking. In a vivid flash, he saw himself crushed, the stage collapsing in a whirlwind of dust and screams. The rarefied air became unbreathable, and the smell of dust and destruction filled his nostrils. The sound of disaster echoed in his mind, a chilling premonition that made him recoil from his chair, his heart pounding uncontrollably. He knew this was his death. The premonition chilled Ricardo to the bone. The Century Park Hotel, a Chicago icon, once a haven of grandeur, now seemed a death trap. The chess tournament, the passion of his life, suddenly lost all meaning. His opponent, a young prodigy with his face immersed in concentration, awaited his move. But Ricardo saw no pieces, no game. He saw the stage, the wood creaking, the pillars giving way. The smell of twisted metal and dusty plaster was almost palpable in his nostrils. "Mr. Silva?" The voice of the arbiter, a portly man with a grizzled mustache, broke his trance. "Your time is running out." Ricardo forced a smile, his body in a feverish state of alert. He needed a plan, and fast. The survival instinct, stronger than any chess move, overwhelmed him. "I have a terrible headache," he lied, his voice a little hoarser than usual. "I need a break." The arbiter frowned, surprised. Ricardo was known for his unwavering resilience. "There's a lounge, but the game will be delayed by a maximum of 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Time was precious. Ricardo nodded, grabbing his briefcase with a swift motion. He stood up, his eyes sweeping the hall. The stage, majestic and inviting, seemed an open mouth ready to swallow him. The murmur of the crowd, the symphony of clicking pieces, all faded into background noise. His focus was escape. He followed the arbiter to the lounge, his heart hammering against his ribs. The corridor was long, lit by antique lamps that cast dancing shadows. The smell of wax and disinfectant wafted in the air, a futile attempt to mask the musty odor that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He felt the weight of time, each second an hourglass emptying. In the lounge, a red velvet sofa and a small table with a water pitcher. Ricardo grabbed his phone, his hands sweating. He needed a more convincing excuse, something that would get him out of the hotel for hours, maybe days. The image of the collapsing stage was disturbing, but the sight of himself beneath the rubble was even worse. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He thought about calling the doctor, inventing an emergency. But would it be believable? He looked out the window. Outside, Chicago stretched out under a gray sky, the promise of an impending storm in the air. Cars rushed by on the street below, their muffled horns a contrast to the oppressive silence of the room. The temperature seemed to have dropped a few degrees. He needed something to make him leave that place immediately, without raising suspicion. An idea, risky and desperate, popped into his mind. He faked a call, speaking loud enough for the arbiter to hear. "Yes, a serious accident ... at the airport? My sister is going to the hospital? My God, I'm on my way." He hung up, his face pale. "I'm so sorry, arbiter. My sister was in a serious accident at the airport. I have to go." The arbiter, visibly concerned, nodded. "Go, Ricardo. Your family is more important. We'll inform the organization." Ricardo left the room in a hurry, relief mixed with a pang of guilt for the lie. But guilt was a small price to pay for life. He walked down the corridor, each step a triumph over the fate that awaited him in the main hall. The muffled sound of the crowd, the smell of coffee and sweat from the participants, all seemed a distant echo. He passed the front desk, where a distracted receptionist typed on her computer, oblivious to the anxiety in his eyes. Outside, the cold Chicago breeze hit him, bringing with it the smell of ozone and rain. The sky was darker, and the first drops began to fall. He hailed a taxi, his destination as far as possible from the Century Park Hotel. He convinced himself that he had tricked death, that he was safe. But fate, like a chess master, had already predicted his next move. Ricardo was in the taxi, his gaze fixed on the urban landscape receding behind them. Chicago's imposing buildings seemed to shrink in the rearview mirror, and with them, the imminent threat. The driver, a quiet man in a baseball cap, seemed oblivious to the desperate escape Ricardo orchestrated. The rain began to fall harder, drumming on the windshield and adding a layer of melancholy to the already gloomy afternoon. The smell of wet asphalt permeated the car. Ricardo turned on the radio, seeking some distraction. A local news station announced a highway accident traffic jams. Nothing about the Century Park Hotel. Where to, sir? The driver's deep voice pulled him from his thoughts. Anywhere far from here, Ricardo responded impulsively, then corrected himself. To Millennium Park. I want to take a walk. He needed air, space to think. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but a sense of relief was beginning to settle in. He had dodged it. Death, however shrewd, couldn't predict his every move, he thought. Or could it? A shiver ran down his spine. The premonition had been so vivid, so real. Upon arriving at Millennium Park, the rain had turned into a fine drizzle. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the surroundings. Ricardo walked aimlessly, his shoes sinking slightly into the soaked grass. The Cloud Gate, the famous bean sculpture, reflected the gray, distorted sky. He felt like a ghost, observing the world through a veil. His phone rang. It was Clara, his sister. His heart skipped a beat. Was she okay then? The lie about the accident weighed on his conscience. Ricardo, where are you? Her voice was thick with tears. I just found out about Dad. Ricardo's world spun. What happened to Dad? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. He had a heart attack. It was sudden. It happened an hour ago. I'm going to the hospital. The air seemed to thin. The sound of the rain intensified, but Ricardo could barely hear it. He felt a lump in his throat, a sharp pain in his chest. His father, a man who had taught him to play chess, a pillar in his life. The irony was cruel. He had fled an imminent death at the hotel, but another, more intimate and painful, awaited him. I'm going there, Ricardo said, his voice trembling. He hailed another taxi, the destination now Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The journey seemed an eternity. With each passing minute, the image of his father, with his piercing blue eyes and gentle smile, flashed through his mind. The smell of disinfectant and medicine in the hospital was overwhelming, mixing with the scent of pain and loss. Clara was waiting for him at the reception, her eyes red and swollen. He's gone, Ricardo, she said, her voice almost inaudible, and hugged him. Amidst the pain, an old memory resurfaced. As a child, Ricardo and his father played chess on an old wooden board. There was a piece, an ebony knight, which his father always called the lucky piece. Once, during a game, his father warned him, "Never lose the ebony knight, my son. It's life's checkmate." Ricardo had never fully understood the meaning of that phrase until now. In his haste to leave home for the tournament, he had forgotten to put the lucky piece in his pocket, as he always did. It was a superstition, a habit. But at that moment, it seemed more than that. A forgotten piece, a checkmate in his personal life. Death, like a grandmaster, had moved its pieces in a way he could never have predicted. The game wasn't on the chessboard, but in life itself. And he was losing. The days that followed his father's death were a blur of pain and regret for Ricardo. The funeral was in Evanston, his father's hometown, about half an hour from Chicago. The autumn air was cold and damp, and the smell of cemetery flowers hung in the air, a sweet and sad perfume. The family hall, once a haven of laughter and chess games, now echoed with a heavy silence. Clara was inconsolable, and Ricardo felt helpless. He spent sleepless nights, his mind disturbed. The premonition of the collapsing stage, the escape, his father's unexpected death. It all seemed part of a larger plan, a macabre game where death was the supreme player. He had avoided one fate, only to be led to another. The lucky piece, the ebony knight his father cherished so much, became an obsession. He rummaged through the house, looking for it, as if finding it could undo what had happened. He searched in old boxes, dusty drawers, even in the pockets of forgotten coats. The smell of mothballs and aged paper filled the air in his frantic search, but the piece was nowhere to be found. "What are you looking for, Ricardo?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching him rummage through the bookshelf in the living room. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "The ebony knight," he replied, almost whispering. "Dad's lucky piece." Clara sighed. "Oh, that piece. I never understood why he attached so much importance to it." "It was important to him," Ricardo said, his voice choked. He picked up an old book, its yellowed pages smelling of mold and old paper. "He always said it had a special power," Clara continued, sitting on the sofa. "Once, he told me the piece was a link between him and, well, between him and destiny, I guess. A link to destiny." Clara's words resonated in Ricardo's mind. That was it. The piece wasn't just an amulet. It was a connection. And by forgetting it, he had broken that connection, opening a rift for destiny to take an unexpected path. Days turned into weeks. The chess tournament was indefinitely postponed, an insignificant footnote in the face of his loss. Ricardo tried to return to his routine, but the concentration that once defined him was fragmented. Every game seemed a reminder of the larger game he had lost. He sat at the board, the smell of polished wood and the usual calm of concentration, but saw only the image of the collapsing stage, his father's face, the absent ebony knight. One night, as he tried to sleep, Ricardo's mind was invaded by a new premonition. It wasn't violent like the first, but equally terrifying. He saw himself in a dark, endless place, surrounded by profound silence. There was no pain, but an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The smell of dust and oblivion hung in the air. It was as if death was approaching, but in a different, more subtle way. He got up, sweating profusely. The room temperature seemed to have dropped. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting long, distorted shadows. He felt the need to flee again, to hide. But where? Death, he realized, was not an isolated event, but a complex web, with invisible threads connected to every aspect of his life. He had tried to cut one thread, but only entangled himself in another. And the ebony knight, that small forgotten piece, seemed to be the central knot of this web. Ricardo was in his apartment in Brooklyn, New York, the vibrant city he had chosen as his refuge after his father's death. The New York air, with its smell of asphalt, street food, and inexhaustible energy, was a stark contrast to the melancholic quietness of Evanston. He had moved hoping to leave behind the painful memories, to start anew. But the past, like a specter, followed him. His apartment, small and cozy, was organized with the meticulousness of a chess player. Books on strategy and game theory piled on the shelves, and a marble chessboard rested on a coffee table. However, the sparkle in his eyes had diminished, replaced by a persistent shadow. He tried to reconnect with the world of chess, participating in smaller tournaments in local cafes and clubs. The smell of fresh coffee and the bustle of people around were comforting, but the passion had vanished. He played by inertia, his movements calculated, but without the spark of genius that had made him famous. One afternoon, while walking through Washington Square Park, the autumn sun filtering through the leaves of the trees, he saw a group of elderly people playing chess. The sound of clicking pieces, the murmur of strategies and laughter. It was a familiar scene, an echo of his childhood with his father. He stopped, observing. One of the players, an old man with a white beard and kind eyes, invited him to a game. Ricardo hesitated. He didn't want to, but something compelled him. He sat down, the smell of damp grass and dry leaves filling his nostrils. The board in front of him seemed strangely familiar. Then he saw it. One of the old man's pieces, an ebony knight, identical to his father's. Ricardo's heart pounded. "What a beautiful piece," Ricardo commented, his voice a little hoarse. "Ah, this one," the old man smiled. "It's a family heirloom. They say it brings good luck." Ricardo reached out, hesitant, and touched the piece. The wood was cold, polished by time. A wave of memories washed over him, his father's touch, the advice about checkmate. It was impossible. How could that piece be there? The world seemed to contract around him. The park noise, the children's shouts, the dog's barks, all seemed distant. "You look shocked, young man," the old man said, his smile fading. It's identical to a piece my father had," Ricardo replied, trying to remain calm. He called it the lucky piece. The old man shook his head. "Coincidences of life, perhaps. But this piece has a long history. It belonged to my grandfather, who was a great chess master. He brought it from a trip to Europe many years ago." Ricardo felt a shiver down his spine. Europe. His father had bought the piece on a trip to Europe when he was young. Could it be? A chess piece, traversing generations, reappearing in his life so unexpectedly? He finished the game, his mind in a whirl. The premonition in the hotel, his father's death, and now the appearance of the ebony knight. It was as if the chess pieces were moving around him in a game he couldn't decipher. The air in the park seemed to have grown colder. He said goodbye to the old man, thanking him for the game. He walked back home, his head heavy. The city, with its vibrant energy, seemed distant. His father's death had been an unexpected checkmate in his personal life. And now, the appearance of the ebony knight seemed to be a warning, a piece in a new stage of the game. Death, he realized, didn't just play on the board. It played with life, with emotions, with connections. And he, Ricardo, was just a pawn in its grand scheme. The appearance of the ebony knight in Washington Square Park deeply disturbed Ricardo. He spent the following days in a frantic search for information, visiting antique shops in Greenwich Village, libraries in Manhattan, and even online forums for chess collectors. The smell of old books and dust filled his nostrils with each search. He was determined to unravel the mystery of that piece. In a small antique shop on a side street, smelling of old wood and rusty metal, he found an elderly bookseller with glasses perched on his nose. Ricardo described the ebony knight, his eyes anxious. The bookseller, after a moment of reflection, pulled a dusty book from a high shelf. "Ah, yes, the Knight of Fortune, a legend among collectors. They say this piece was cursed by a chess master in the 17th century. Anyone who possesses it is doomed to a usual fate." Ricardo shivered. "Unusual how?" "The legend says that death plays with whoever possesses it," the bookseller explained, his voice grave. "And always, without exception, it delivers the final checkmate." Ricardo felt his blood run cold. The smell of incense and mystery in the antique shop seemed to suffocate him. He had tried to trick death, but it had been playing with him for a long time, using his father's piece as a pawn. And his father's death was death's first move in his life. Is there any way to stop it? Ricardo asked, his voice almost a whisper. The bookseller shook his head. The legend doesn't mention a way to stop it. Death is the player, and you, young man, are the challenger. But not every challenger defeats death. Ricardo left the antique shop with his mind in a whirl. The New York sun, once a relief, now seemed like a spotlight on his impending doom. The city, once vibrant and full of life, seemed a stage for his own end. The honking of horns and the murmur of people seemed a distant chorus, indifferent to his torment. He tried to rationalize legends, superstitions. But the premonition at the hotel, his father's unexpected death, and now the appearance of the Ebony Knight... It was too much to be mere coincidence. Death wasn't just coming for him. It was playing with him, moving the pieces on its grand board. The game had begun a long time ago, without his knowing. Ricardo felt the need to get away from everything, to isolate himself. He rented a remote cabin in the Catskill Mountains in New York State, a few hours' drive from the city. The wilderness, with its smell of pine and damp earth, would offer him the quiet he needed to think, to perhaps find a way out. The cabin was rustic, with wooden walls and a fireplace that exuded the smell of smoke and burning wood. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of birds and the whisper of the wind through the trees. He lit a fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth of the fire was a contrast to the cold that seemed to have settled in his soul. He picked up an old chessboard he found in the cabin, its pieces dusty. He arranged the pieces, the king and queen, the bishops and rooks, the knights. But an empty space remained, that of the lucky piece. He looked at the space, the absence of the Ebony Knight screaming in his mind. The smell of aged wood, the sound of the pieces in his hands. Everything was a constant reminder of the game. Each day in the cabin, Ricardo felt closer to something inevitable. The temperature dropped at dusk, and he bundled himself in blankets, the cold permeating his bones. The solitude was overwhelming, but also an invitation to reflection. He had tried to be a strategist, a chess master, but life and death proved to be much shrewder adversaries. He was in checkmate, and the end was near. But the way the checkmate would be delivered remained a mystery, a final, dark move in a game he was destined to lose. The days in the Catskill Mountains cabin dragged on, each heavier than the last. Ricardo felt time slip through his fingers like sand from an hourglass. Solitude, once a refuge, became a prison. The smell of pine and the humidity of the forest seemed like a shroud. He knew the end was approaching, but the form, death's final move, was still an enigma. One night, a severe storm hit the mountains. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain beat furiously on the cabin roof. Lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the dense forest in ghostly flashes. The smell of ozone filled the air, mixing with the odor of smoke from the fireplace. Ricardo sat by the fire, its warmth only superficially comforting him. Suddenly, a crash. Not thunder, but something closer, more real. The cabin shook. Ricardo stood up, his heart pounding. He looked out the window, the rain obscuring his view. Lightning had struck a nearby tree, and the sound of wood cracking and falling reverberated through the forest. Another crash, and the cabin was hit by something heavy. A huge branch, torn by the wind, had fallen onto the roof, opening a crack and bringing down part of the chimney. Smoke and soot filled the room. The smell of burning wood and plaster mixed with the damp air of the storm. Ricardo backed away, coughing. Death, he thought, was using nature itself as its harbinger. He tried to leave the cabin, but the door was jammed by debris. Panic began to set in. He was trapped. He looked around, desperate for an exit. The fire in the fireplace, fueled by the draft coming through the roof crack, was growing dangerously. The flames danced, casting terrifying shadows on the walls. The heat intensified, and the air became increasingly thick with smoke. He tried to break the window, but the wood was rotten and wouldn't give way. Ricardo closed his eyes. He had tried to escape the premonition, death's first move. He had tried to be a strategist, but death was the master. The Ebony Knight, the forgotten piece, had been the link, the checkmate in his personal life. And now, trapped in the cabin, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the fury of the storm, he realized that the final checkmate would not be a violent accident, nor a sudden illness. It would be a silence, an absence. Ricardo's last breath was imperceptible, lost in the howl of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Death, like a silent shadow, had finally delivered its final checkmate. The cabin, consumed by flames, collapsed in on itself, becoming a pile of smoldering rubble under the relentless rain. The next day, when the storm passed, all that remained was the smell of smoke and destruction, and the silence of the forest, which seemed to hold a dark secret. Death always delivers the final checkmate. And Ricardo, the master strategist, had become just a piece in its grand and ultimate game. Ricardo's story is a grim reminder that fate, at times, plays a game beyond our comprehension. He tried to evade, to redefine his strategies, but on the great chessboard of life, death always holds the final move. What would you do if you knew your checkmate?